We'll get started on this talk about time and uncertainty. And on Monday, when we were talking about the most basic features of human action, we pointed out that one of the things that we immediately arrive at when we begin to reflect upon human action, as Dr. Gordon would say, we begin to just think about human action, ends and means and so on and so forth. So we quickly hit upon this idea of scarcity that we see as traceable back to a more fundamental feature of human existence, which is our finitude. We're simply finite creatures, and we're not able, because of this, to attain our ends by a direct act of will, and therefore all the attempts that we make at acting only satisfy our ends to some degree. Right? We're just incapable. That's what it means to be finite. Right? If we were infinite like God, we could just will our ends to be attained, and they would be attained immediately and fully. So here, when we talk about time and uncertainty, we're obviously bringing out another aspect of human nature that we find as we reflect upon human action, which is our temporal nature, that we're temporal beings. Again, unlike God, who stands outside of time, we are bound in time. And because we're bound in time, well, all of our action takes place in the context of time, and therefore it becomes important for us to, in economic theory, to analyze, to understand how our action is existing in time, what the implications of this are. And we'll see that there are really two broad implications that we want to talk about when we talk about time and uncertainty. One is obviously uncertainty, that again, as temporal beings who are finite, we're only able to anticipate the realization of our ends when we decide to act. And so we have this sort of fundamental uncertainty. We can have foresight about the future. We can predict it to some degree. But we can't have foreknowledge about the future, again, unlike God, who knows everything and stands outside of time. And then the other thing is the way that we value action with respect to time. So this is what we want to focus on first. And then we'll talk in the second part about the features of uncertainty. So let's again just quickly recount this discussion we've had already about valuing and about ends and means and so on. So we said already we formulate ends that we wish to attain through our action. We design our action. To attain these ends, we acquire the means that we perceive to be causally connected to the ends, and then apply them to the attainment of our ends. That we do this, we don't have to do this directly. It isn't necessary for all of our ends to be satisfied by one step of production, but we can, as we have human intelligence, we're able to see that there are causal connections in a long chain of relationships between means and ends, so we can erect capital structures. We can start by mining iron and then producing steel and then forming the steel into fenders for a car and then making the car. Right? We can extend the extent to which we attach our means by valuing things to the attainment of our ends. So we have consumer goods, we have producer goods, we have the capital structure. We've talked about all of these elements of economic activity already during the week. How we value things with respect to this, right? So we value Honda Accords, and so we pay certain prices, and these prices then justify and provide revenue for the entrepreneur to demand the factors of production, to buy the steel, and so on and so forth. And this provides revenues for the steel manufacturer to buy his inputs, and so we get this long drawn out structure of production. Lots of indirect, as boehm-bawerk would say, roundabout production, or as we would say, indirect production. And we talked about all the, kind of the causal connections that are involved in here, the technology, the production functions, the valuing process, and so on and so forth. And now we just want to focus on time. Obviously, again, all of this activity takes time. We must be valuing with respect to time when we're engaged in these activities. And then, as I mentioned, the principle of uncertainty. Okay, so let's start with some of the basic principles. And Mises makes a great point in Human Action the first time you, like many of the original insights that he has, or it's not maybe original with him in the philosophical sense, chronologically, but it's original in the sense of, here's the first economist that you'll read probably who says this, and so it sort of awakens you to other implications of this. He says, there's a big difference between clock time, between measuring time. We say every second is passing away, and we have, this year followed by that year, and we mark off time, and so on and so forth. Because when we think about clock time, we just have the past with respect to the current moment, we call the present, and then that moment is, or those moments are constantly passing into the past, and then we have the future. So when we just think about the mechanics of time, well, that's one way to think about it. But Mises says this is not the praxeological way of thinking about time. This is not the way we think about time in human action. The way we think about time in human action, we can use the same words, past, present, and future if we wish, but really what we do in human action is we divide time into the time before an action, the time during an action, and the time after action. So it looks like this, right? We have before, during, and after. And the reason this is important is because these are choice variables for us. Right? We decide when to start an action. We decide how long to continue it. And we decide when the action is finished. And this is all, again, subject to uncertainty. We'll set those problems aside, right, and talk about that later. But this is a critical point, just to see that with respect to time, the present period, so to speak, as Mises would put it, is that time of the action itself. And then we can further divide this time during action into component parts. So during the action, we have what Mises calls the period of production. And the period of production includes the capital structure, all the stages of production. Right? So we decide to build an automobile, and we start by mining iron today, and then 6 months later we've produced the steel and made the fenders and assembled the car. So we have like a 6-month period of production, or whatever the period of production is for the particular good. And so we have the stages of production, and then we have what Mises calls maturing time. This is potentially involved in action as well. So the classic case would be wine, right? We want to be wine growers, and so we go through the stages of production, but when we get to this sort of last stage, we get to the final stage before the consumption stage, there's just like a maturation process that the good has to go through before it becomes a consumer good. So that could be also part of the process of acting. Is it time between taking an action and the effects that occur? So we take the action and then we wait, and the effects occur at the end. And then, in addition to this, there's the duration of serviceableness. The duration of serviceableness of the goods. And we take this into account as well. This is a time over which the good generates valuable services for us. So different goods have different durability. This is also a choice variable. We can engage in production to produce a house that would last usably for 10 years, like a mobile home or whatever, or one that would last for thousands of years. We choose with respect to this element in action. Right? This is a time element in action that we choose with respect to. The same would be true of capital goods. So with capital goods, we can choose more durable machines, more durable factories, or we could produce less durable ones. And they'll have other different dimensions to them. But we have to take this into account. Why? Because our action is in time. If we didn't care about time in acting, we wouldn't care about durability, right? This would seem to be irrelevant to us. Okay, so we have to take this into account as well. Now, Mises points out that most economists, even his mentor, boehm-bawerk, did not treat these ideas of the period of production and duration of serviceableness in a completely accurate praxeological way. As Mises points out, when we talk about the factors that affect our decisions as human beings, they are always forward-looking. Right? We talk about an end, in other words, we're talking about our anticipation of the realization of an end in the future when we go through the period of time engaged in production and consumption. It's the same with these ideas. The period of production is important for us to incorporate in our decision to act now. So let's say, a few years ago, my wife and I had a new house built, and in thinking about how to do this, what process we'd go through, and what resources would be used, what expense would be involved, and so on and so forth. These two elements are part of the decision process. How long does it take to build the house? How long are we willing to wait from the beginning to the end? Is it a 6-month process? Is it a 1-year process? We start paying out the dough, right, to start the process, and how long does it go on? It makes a difference if it's 6 months or if it's a year, if it's paying out over 2 years and what have you. And the duration of serviceableness. Do we want a house that lasts for 20 years, usefully for 40 years, for 50 years? This is also a choice variable. And it's under our power to be able to say, no, we want a house built more quickly that's less durable. Or, we could hire more resources, more people to come in and time it better and spend even more money and get a more durable house in a shorter period of production. That's all up to us to decide. In other words, these concepts are not something that we just look back on the past and we say, well, in the past they had this period of production, we're doing history or something, or in the past, Mercedes were more durable than Hondas and so on and so forth. We're just doing kind of historical analysis. These are actual decision-making elements in human action. Okay, now Mises gets to another basic point where he says there's something much different about time. Something's unique about time relative to other elements in decision-making factors in action. When we think about means, for example, as factors that we decide with respect to in acting, we talk about allocating our means, choosing how to use them. We apply labor to one action and not to another, or we spend money here and not there, and so on and so forth. Well, it again, upon reflection, becomes pretty quickly evident that we cannot do this with time. We cannot allocate time. Time isn't a means, Mises says. Time is different. It doesn't mean that we don't act with respect to time or that we don't value time and so on and so forth. It's just not the same as me. We don't own time, right? We can't store it up and dispense it at will like we can labor or money or land or so on and so forth. As Mises puts it, time is an irreversible flux for us. For temporal beings, time just marches on, right, from the next, to the next moment, and then the next, and the next, and the next. And if we don't possess it, we can't allocate it then as means. As Mises puts it in different terminology, he says the relevant notions of time are sooner and later, not more and less time, but sooner and later. This is the relevant praxeological notion. This is a relevant notion in human action with respect to time. Do we take an act sooner, or do we engage in this act later, as opposed to more and less time, as we would with means? I use more time to do this, or I use less time. Sooner and later is relevant to us with respect to time. Okay, now let's get on to the valuing part of this. Remember, again, we're going to divide our discussion into the two ways of valuing time. Take these in turn, and then we'll see that these two intersect, and so we have to figure out the relationship between these two ways of valuing time, and then we'll move on to uncertainty. Okay, so the two ways of valuing time are, first of all, to economize our action with respect to time. Just because time isn't a means doesn't mean that we can't economize our action with respect to time. Economizing, you may recall from our definition on Monday, refers to acting in such a way as to bring about a more highly valued end. Right? We apply our means or whatever it is we're choosing with respect to in such a way that our choice is for the higher valued option, setting aside the lesser valued one. If we can do that with respect to time, then we can economize, because that's all economizing means. Okay, so how would we do this with respect to time? With respect to sooner and later, how would it be possible for us to choose in such a way that we get a greater value from a given action as opposed to a lesser value? And this we might call when we think about economizing time, we might call this the timing of an action. In other words, we choose the timing of an action. We say, any particular action I can take today, or I could take next week, or I could take in a month. You know, if I wanted to take let's say a European vacation, I wanted to tour Italy, I could do this. Let's say next summer, or I could do it 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or I could at least envision doing this. Right? I mean, I'm again uncertain about whether or not I can actually do it, but we're setting aside uncertainty. I have a plethora of possibilities. Now, with some actions, maybe I can't do this. There might be some actions that I can only take at particular points in time, in which case I can't economize with respect to. I can't choose my action in such a way that I get more value simply because I've taken it at this moment in time as opposed to that moment. But for some actions, I can do this. The case I always give my undergraduate students is, we have, let's say my wife and I have our anniversary, November 17th, our wedding anniversary. And so we want to celebrate our wedding anniversary. Now, we could choose to celebrate our wedding anniversary on any day of the year. We could do it tomorrow, right? We could do it on Halloween, or on Christmas Day, or June 1st. But it's more valuable to us to do it on November 17th. Right? I get more value from the same action if I take it at some particular moment in time. If I take the European vacation when I'm, let's say, wealthier, or after I've already learned Italian, then the value of that end, the value of attaining that end is greater to me. The same action has more value to me if I take it at one moment in time relative to another. Notice the same thing then would be true of goods. Same thing is true of means, right? A means could have more value to me at a future point in time because I'm employing it to attain a more valuable end that exists at that future moment in time as opposed to the present. Now, here's the complication. If you followed me up to this point, let's suppose then that we trade. Let's suppose we engage in intertemporal trade with respect to these things. Let's suppose that I have a bottle of champagne in my possession that I'd like to use for celebrating, my wife and I for celebrating our anniversary. But I don't have any easy way to store it. Maybe I'm concerned that she might find it, and spoil the surprise or whatever. And so I'm perfectly willing to trade it. Trade it intertemporally. I'll sell it to you today on the condition that you return a bottle of similar champagne to me in the future. And notice, I'd be willing to pay a premium to do this. These sorts of markets, by the way, are called futures markets. You've heard of these, right? When we're economizing on time and we wish to trade on the basis of reverse order preferences with respect to who values the future end, the future use of the means more, and who values the present use of the means more, we engage in what we call futures trade. So, the futures price of oil might be higher than the present price of oil. Why? Well, because people have certain ends in the future that they place greater value on. They think they're going to get greater value from the ends achieved in the future from the same means that could be available to people in the present to accomplish their ends. And there's mutually advantageous trade. Now, the reason I point this out is because this sort of trade does not contradict time preference, does it? We haven't said anything at all about time preference yet. That's the second way of valuing action with respect to time. There are two ways to value action with respect to time. We can economize time, we can choose the timing of our action, and we have time preference. And not all intertemporal trade is purely time preference trade. This is a sort of important fundamental point to grasp in this whole area. A lot of controversy exists with respect to the nature of time preference and intertemporal trade that I think can be dispelled by recognizing these two different elements of intertemporal trade. And we're all, as soon as we say this, as soon as we say, hey, they're futures markets, and certainly future prices can be higher, not lower, than present prices, right? Or suppose with time preference, the future is always discounted, right, with respect to the present. Then we can begin to see that we can disentangle these things in the market. In fact, they're separable, and we can separate out the time preference element from the economizing, valuing element of intertemporal trade. That becomes possible. Okay, and we'll talk about how that's done as we go through the discussion. But I simply want to point out that it does exist. These two elements do exist as separable elements of action. I'm not saying that they can't be combined in action. I'm just saying that they are both conceptually separable, and we can, in fact, separate them in the market. We'll talk about how that's possible again in a minute. Okay, so we have that as one element. This, again, we call economizing time. We'd look to the futures markets as the manifestation of economizing time in the market. Then, as I said, the other element of valuing time is time preference. Now, time preference is an entirely different facet of valuing time. With economizing time, we say, for a given action, if I take this action and attain it at one moment in time, I might get a different value than if I take the same action at a different moment in time. With time preference, we say this. Let's suppose that that's not true. Let's suppose that no matter what moment in time I take an action, I get exactly the same satisfaction. Maybe this would happen, maybe it wouldn't in any particular action. That's a assumption. That's a ceteris paribus claim, right? Let's suppose that is held constant. Then we ask this question: for a given satisfaction that I could obtain, today or next week or next month or the year after that, do I value intertemporally the same satisfaction the same? Do I place the same value on getting the same satisfaction today versus next week versus a month from now versus, if I want the enjoyment of eating an apple, do I place the same value on this enjoyment that I get if I can eat it today versus eating it 10 years from now? Would I rather have $100 in my hand today to satisfy my ends, or an equivalent amount of purchasing power in my hand 10 years from today? Well, no, I'd prefer it today, right? I prefer sooner to later. For a given satisfaction, I prefer the satisfaction sooner and not later. Why is this true? It's true because we're temporal. We're temporal beings. We make a distinction between sooner and later, and we have a preference for sooner. This is ingrained in human nature. Okay, so then Mises goes on and he says, let's provide some sort of ancillary arguments in favor of time preference. Let's suppose that, engage in kind of an imaginary construct. Let's suppose that time preference were false. Let's suppose, in other words, that we didn't have time preference, we had the reverse of time preference. Let's suppose we always preferred a satisfaction later in time as opposed to sooner. I always preferred to eat the ham sandwich tomorrow as opposed to getting the satisfaction of a given satisfaction that I could get today. Well, obviously, then I would never eat, right? If I always preferred future satisfactions, I would never act toward a present satisfaction. I would always delay my satisfaction. You see, this is why we must have time preference, because we act in the present. And when we act in the present, because we could have chosen to have delayed this action into the future, we're demonstrating time preference. This is Mises's claim. Let's suppose, on the other hand, that we don't care. We make no distinction in value between sooner and later. It just doesn't matter to us. We distinguish in time between sooner and later, but not in value. Well, then Mises says, look, if that were the case, what we would do is we would engage in, as long as we could find longer processes of production that are more productive, we would engage in those. We would never sort of immediately set out to get the most productive, shortest processes of production. We would immediately set out on the longest, most productive production processes. Why? Well, if we don't care about when we get the goods, then having more goods, which we can get with the longer processes, are better to us than having fewer goods. So it would be like Henry Ford, back in the early part of the 20th century. Instead of just starting out and making a crummy, Model A, right? This crummy car that didn't, barely ran and broke down all the time. The tires pop every time you hit a rock or whatever. No, why do that? He would just set out on making a 2010 S-Class Mercedes. He would have started that process in 1910. And people wouldn't care, right? They wouldn't say, well, I'll take the crummy car for what's better than riding a horse, or better walking or riding my bicycle. At least I have some, mechanical means of transportation, for these 5 years or these 10 years, and then I get a better one in 10 years. And we just immediately set out on the longest processes possible. We probably, to make it more fanciful, we probably set out on processes of production, Ford would have, not to produce a land-bound, automobile type vehicle at all. We'd set out on, personal hovercrafts or whatever we're going to have in the future. Jetpacks or whatever that take us around, or those Star Wars beaming devices that beam our molecules and reconstruct them in different places. I mean, if we eventually get this sort of stuff. No, we'd set on that right away. Robinson Crusoe would set out on those things, right? If he didn't care between sooner and later. So these are the points Mises brings about in favor of this. Now notice, if we accept time preference, certain implications follow from this. And so let's recount these, not the least of which is interest, but we'll talk about interest at the end. He points out that not only do we have time preference, but there's another sort of feature of the world that we have to take into account when we think about time as an element of acting. And this could be different. It just happens to be a feature of our world. It's sort of an empirical fact of the world. An empirical fact of the world that he wants to mention here is that the shortest processes of production do not satisfy all of our ends. So the shortest processes of production are like, picking fruit off trees, catching fish in streams with your bare hands. These are the most direct processes of production. No stages of production, right? We just sort of immediately take our labor and go directly to the production of consumer goods. No, if we do this, we don't get very much. We're just living hand to mouth. And no, we have other ends that we'd like to attain. In order to attain these other ends, we have to engage in longer processes of production. But here's where time preference comes in. What must be true about the value of the goods that we get in the longer processes of production if we're obtaining them by surrendering the production of shorter production processes? Well, the value must be greater, right? Why else would we do this? As long as we have time preference, we'll never surrender the same valued goods that we can get sooner, only to obtain the exact same valued goods that we can get later. We'll never give up $1,000 today in our hand just to have somebody pay us back $1,000 in 5 years. Right? We'll only surrender the sooner in time option to get a later in time option if the later in time option is more valuable to us. Now notice what follows from this is that at any given moment in time, at least if we can imagine an equilibrium, again we're setting aside uncertainty, but for any given moment in time, people will have already exploited all of the most productive, shortest production processes. These are not available to us anymore because we've already undertaken them. And therefore, when we wish to expand the capital structure, the only options we have are longer, more productive production processes. Why? Because we already, let's say, for example, we can use the oil production as an example of this, right? So, you start out in the 1800s in western Pennsylvania near where I live, discovering the process by which you can commercially use oil. And what do the entrepreneurs go for first in terms of production processes? They go for the oil that's easiest to get, right? The shortest production processes they can engage in. So the mechanical devices, the oil rigs, the wells, the locations where they put the drilling equipment, how they get the oil up out of the ground. We exhaust these then. And then when these are exhausted, or as they're engaged in production, if we're going to expand oil production, we have to go into areas of production that take longer processes of production. We have to learn how to drill through a mile of water before we get down to the bottom of the ocean floor. And, we have to build this gigantic rig out in the middle of the Gulf in order to support all this capital production process. This is a longer but more productive production process. It's more productive now because the value of oil is high enough to justify it, right? And it's not more physically productive, let's say, but it's more value productive than the older production processes. Okay, so this is a very important point when we get to business cycle theory. Right? Or when we talk about capital accumulation processes. So you remember the story of the business cycle is that when the government engages in monetary inflation, credit expansion, and artificially suppresses interest rates below the market level, the whole structure of production is lengthened out. And some critics of the Austrian business cycle theory say, well, why does it have to be lengthened out? Why can't entrepreneurs just sort of repeat the same things and not lengthen out the structure? Why don't they just build the same steel mills right? And one of the answers is to this, entrepreneurs are going to innovate into the longer, more productive production processes precisely because they've already exhausted all the shorter, most productive production processes. It doesn't do any good to try to repeat those. It doesn't do any good to try to, set up an oil production system like the one in old Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1870. Right? That's not going to be the most value-enhancing production process. It's going to be drilling in deep water or something else. Again, I'm setting aside all the complications here. You get the basic idea. Okay, now Mises also goes on to point out that all the exceptions that are brought up against time preferences are false. It's pretty easy, again, to show just by the logic of acting and by the logic of this argument about time preference that any alleged exception to a time preference, oh no, in this case there isn't time preference, or there's the opposite of time preference, or valuing the future more than the present or something, are all false. They must be false just by the logic of this claim, right? Now notice, before we go into some of the possibilities here, because this is, again, kind of an interesting area to move through just to see how well we comprehend the logic of the argument, let me point out that exactly the same thing is true about preferences. Not time preferences, but preferences, the concept of preference as we use it in economic analysis. It's also true that you can't find a human action that contradicts preference. Why? Because this is what we mean by preference. Remember, demonstrated preference, as we talked about on Monday, is just the idea that in an action, the person acting establishes a rank order between the options of acting, saying, I prefer this option more and I prefer this one less. And the logic of acting is always that he acts toward what he prefers more. Why is this the case? Because, well, that's just what purposefulness means in acting. If a person could act toward the alternative, it must mean that they value that more highly. That's just the way we use the word value, right? It's bound up in the way that we act. So the same with time preference. You have the same kind of logical difficulty. I give this example to my students. I say, look, you see this sort of thing all the time. You see this guy, and he's down at the coffee shop, and he's dragging on a cigarette. And you're sitting at the next table, and the guy's with his buddy, and he says, I hate this habit of smoking cigarettes. This is just nasty. And I just hate it. And then he takes another drag. So is Is this a contradiction of his preference? Is he... No, of course he prefers to smoke, right? How do we know this? He is smoking. He's smoking. That's what he prefers to do. He can whine and complain and say, he may actually in his heart of hearts wish he didn't smoke. But this doesn't contradict his preference. Remember, Austrian economics is trying to explain action. Not what we say about action. Not psychologically how we think about action or something. We're trying to explain action. How do you explain a smoker who says, "Oh, I hate smoking"? How do you explain that if you don't have the praxeological apparatus? Well, it's got to be irrationality or addiction or anything, right? So it's the same sort of logical problem that you would have if you try to come up with a counterexample to time preference. So let me give you a few that have been suggested in the literature, and we'll deal with the logic of each of them. And I get these again from Mises. He outlines all these in Human Action. So there may be others that you've thought of, but again, you try to work through the logic on other examples on your own and see how it works out. But anyway, he says, hey, here's a alleged exception. Mises says, here's a guy and he's offered 2 theater tickets, and they're for the same night. They're for Friday night. And he says, "Oh, I wish, that ticket for Othello was for Saturday. I prefer Saturday to Friday, in other words. I prefer to have the future good instead of the present." So is this a contradiction of time preference? Mises says, well, no, it's not a contradiction of time preference. It doesn't have anything to do with time at all. The problem here is he simply offered choices that are incompatible. Right? He can't do both things. This is just a problem of scarcity. He can't do both things. He can only do one. He has to choose between them. Just like we all do in every action. It has nothing to do with time preference. He's just choosing between competing possibilities, both of which he can't enjoy. So this is no example of time or time preference at all. Then there are examples where there are different goods that are postulated. Back to this economizing point that we made before. Sure, if they're different goods, or if they're different actions that can be attained with the same good, the future one could be preferred to the present. Of course that's true. Who denies this, right? But that's not time preference. Time preference says, if we can imagine an action for which we get the same satisfaction no matter when we take the action, we prefer that satisfaction sooner. We prefer a given satisfaction sooner to the same satisfaction later. Okay, so the classic example is ice in winter and ice in summer. So in the winter time, the person says, "Ooh, I prefer ice in the summer." So that's supposed to violate time preference, right? I prefer ice in the summer to ice in the winter. He says it's in the winter time. But no, it doesn't, right? Clearly it doesn't. There are many possibilities here. Again, the idea of these being different goods would go something like this. Let's suppose that what this guy means, and we'd have to fill in the blanks to get this, but let's suppose what he means by this is I can use ice in the winter as a producer good to produce ice in the summer. I mean, maybe that's what he means. Maybe not, but maybe it is. So he goes out and he just, he's in, Sweden or something, and he goes out and he cuts a big block of ice right there in his yard and takes it in and puts it in his cooler, and he saves it for the summer. Well, if that's what he's doing, of course the future value, so to speak, is greater than the present, right? Because ends have to have greater value than means, and consumer goods have to have greater value than factors of production. So that's no exception to time preference. The other possibility would be, well, maybe it's not like that, right? But the other possibility would be covered by this economizing argument that we made before. So, for example, maybe it's just the fact that there's diminishing marginal utility involved, right? He's got a lot of ice in the winter, and so a unit of ice to him isn't worth very much. But in the summer, ice is scarcer to him, right? He has a lower stock of it, and so a unit of it is worth more to him. So it's the same good, but he has a differing value because of differing stocks. Perhaps that's what creates this preference that he has for future as opposed to present possession of ice. And then we get to the economizing part. Again, this is a sensible response here. In the summertime, there are just more uses that people can put ice to than in the wintertime that are valuable to them. If I pour an iced tea and sit out on my deck at my house in the summertime in the afternoon when it's 90 degrees, and I just sit there and look at the forest and sip my iced tea, or if I'm in the South, it would be a mint julep or whatever, and I'm just sitting in the shade, and it's great, and a little sweat coming up, and that's all just wonderful, what I want to do. Well, it's much different than me sitting on my porch or under my, my veranda and my plantation with my mint julep in the wintertime, especially in Grove City, where it's like 20 below zero. I'm going to sit out and have a cool iced tea, in February or something out on my deck, getting frostbite. No, I don't think so. So maybe it's just that, again, I'm economizing with respect. I recognize, in other words, that if I take an action in the winter, it has less value to me than the same action in the summer. So naturally, I prefer to have the means by which I can take this action in the summer more highly than in the winter. Okay, and then Mises deals with one last one, which is the miser. What about the miser? He's hoarding away and always storing up for the future, presumably, and never consuming in the present. And Mises says, well, a miser has low time preference. That's true. So he has out of his income, he only spends on consumption 10% of his income or something, saves 90%. That may be true. But he doesn't have the opposite of time preference. He's still consuming in the present. He just has a lower time preference than we do. So again, this is not an exception to the general principle of time preference. Okay, now let's move on to the interest rate and cover the main area where Austrians make the implication of time preference to the economy. And you've heard some of this before, so I'll try to just stress things that you may not have received in other discussions. And the first thing to stress is this point that I made before about how we separate in the market, how we separate out the economizing feature of intertemporal exchange from the time preference feature. And notice, again, if you think about this with respect to futures markets and credit markets, you can see right away what the difference is. In futures markets, we trade goods. Right? We trade wheat today for wheat in the future. We trade oil today for oil in the future, and so on and so forth. Or claims on goods. That would be the same thing. A futures market for stocks and bonds and so on and so forth. These are all claims on goods or goods themselves. But in credit markets, we trade money. We trade money, right? And that's the difference. In other words, when we think about economizing with respect to money, we clearly see that there is no difference in time with respect to the suitability of the money to perform the medium of exchange function. A given amount of money will perform the medium of exchange function regardless of whether I spend it today or next week or the week after that or the week after that and so on and so forth. And so there isn't any economizing element with respect to money involved in intertemporal exchange. That's why that's one of the reasons, at least, that credit markets are done in money and could never be done never purely done in kind, right? We could never have barter exchange that would give us a pure interest rate because the exchange between the two, the price, the intertemporal price, would always be a mixture of the economizing value that's involved in future use of the good and time preference. They would always be bound up together in that trade. But with money, there is no economizing element. Because again, money has only one function, which is to perform as a medium of exchange. And its performance as a medium of exchange does not depend upon the time in which it's used. By the way, if it did, it wouldn't be used as money, right? If I thought, in other words, the U.S. dollar is going to be a medium of exchange until Sunday. And then, on Sunday, it's all going to blow up and it's not going to be a medium of exchange. Well, then it wouldn't be, right? If we all thought this. It would just dissolve and it wouldn't be money at all. No, it's money because we still have an anticipation that it will be money, a medium of exchange, when we wish to use it in the future. Otherwise, we wouldn't touch it. We'd say, well, I'm not going to hold it into the future to that point where it's going to collapse as a medium of exchange. No, it has exactly the same suitability as a medium of exchange. Or I'm not saying, by the way, that its purchasing power is the same. I'm just saying that its efficacy as a medium of exchange is the same. Its usefulness as a medium of exchange is the same. And therefore, I don't have any economizing element with respect to it in valuing present money relative to future money. Now, again, there are complications to this that I think you've already talked about, and we want to set aside any complicating factors, and maybe we can get to this in some of questions that you have. We're just trying to focus on the time preference element. In other words, the claim is that only with money can we isolate the time preference element. With goods, we can't do this in intertemporal exchange. But we can do it with money. Under some conditions, we might not be able to do it with money either. But we can never do it with goods. And with money, sometimes we can. That's the claim. Okay, so let's take this simple example. This is the relationship between time preference and the rate of interest. And remember, this is what Mises calls the originary rate of interest, or what Rothbard calls the pure time preference rate of interest, or the pure rate of interest. So again, we're not concerned with the complications of how you adjust the pure rate of interest for riskiness and the price premiums and things like that. We're setting all that aside. Okay, so we have a preference rank where a person is ranking present money against future money, and we know time preference means that everyone will have this type of ranking, right? Everyone will rank $1,000 today over $1,000 of the same purchasing power in a year. But that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be some amount of money large enough to get this person to prefer it to $1,000 today. This difference, the $1,250 in my example, would be the time preference premium that this person would require to exchange present money for future money. Another person might have a preference rank that just has $1,100 in 1 year, in which case that person, we would say, has lower time preference than this person, requires only $100 premium on $1,000 principal to exchange $1,000 of present money for $1,100 a year from today. So this is how time preference manifests itself in the preference rank. And then, of course, as long as people have differences in their preference ranks, they will, as long as some people have higher time preference and some people have lower time preference, there can be mutually advantageous trade. If this guy comes across another guy whose preferences are such that he has, again, let's say the second guy has $1,000 today against $1,100 in 1 year, then they can engage in a mutually advantageous trade. This guy can lend $1,000 to this guy at some premium above $100 and below $250. Right? So that's all we need to explain exchange. And then we get to just a regular market clearing process, right? There'll be a whole spectrum of people with higher time preferences and a whole spectrum of people with lower time preferences. And the interest rate will adjust to the point where the quantity demand, quantity supplied are the same. Why? Because that's the point that generates the most mutually advantageous trade. Everybody's preferences are satisfied at that point. And therefore, there's no reason for anybody to change the situation to some other interest rate. So again, this is we can apply the standard procedure of pricing theory to the rate of interest. Now, let's suppose, in my example, let's suppose that the rate of interest that emerges in the market, or the pure rate of interest that would emerge here, we'll symbolize by little r, is 25%. Let's just suppose it comes out to be that way in the market. Well, then we can see that there's a relationship that exists between future money and present money. The future money would be found by compounding the present money by this interest rate factor. Right? So we would just take the $1,000 multiplied by 1.25, we get the $1,250. So if the interest rate in the market really were 25%, then you could lend $1,000 into this market and get $1,250 back in a year. The market, in other words, would make these two sums of money equivalent. Notice then the reverse is also true, right? If you can find the present value of future money just by algebraically rearranging the formula. So you can find out if you're to receive $1,250 in a year, what the equivalent amount of present money would be through the credit market or the time market. It would be $1,000. This then is the basis for entrepreneurial discounting. This is how the entrepreneurs know how to discount future revenues that they're going to earn from an investment they make today. Once that investment is finished and they're generating the consumer good and selling it and earning the profit stream in the future. Right? They're just engaged in this process of using the credit market to tell them how to value present money with respect to future money. We can do the calculation either way around. Now, I'm not saying that entrepreneurs use a formulistic way to do this. I'm just saying that the market makes it possible for them to determine what this premium is between the present and the future, or what the discount is between the future and the present. Okay, so the market emerges, and as I said before, and we get some interest rate that comes about in the market from the interplay of these factors. Now, when we think about the time market, as Rothbard points out and Mises before him, we can divide it into two parts. So the time market is just all intertemporal exchange of money that occurs in the economy. There are credit markets, which are contractual exchange between the lender and the borrower. And then there's the capital structure, right? All entrepreneurial activity is also part of the time market, because saving and investing to buy the factors of production is done in the present, and then the selling receipts of the output are acquired in the future. So in each stage of production, there has to be the earning of a rate of interest, because the capitalist is lending at the beginning of the process, he's lending sooner, and he's acquiring the revenues later. So Steve Jobs already invested all this money in order to buy the factors of production, build the capital capacity to produce his iPads, and now, he did that 6 months ago or a year ago, and now he's earning revenue. And he'll continue to earn revenue over time, right? And then he'll be making more investments at some future date, earning revenue in the future on those investments as well. So there's a lending and borrowing element of the capital structure. Okay, so let's take a look at this. And again, let's consider this first without uncertainty, and then we'll just have an abbreviated discussion about uncertainty with respect to this question of the capital structure. So let's suppose we have a stage of production where a production process generates the following marginal revenue products. These, remember, are the additional revenue that's generated from possessing this factor of production. Let's say capital. Entrepreneur has a machine, and he estimates that in buying this machine, he'll generate $10,000 in revenue over a year. He estimates that the marginal revenue product of the land that he intends to employ is $5,000, and the labor that he employs is $2,500. But he estimates that he has to pay to get these factors of production today, and he won't sell the output that generates these marginal revenue products until the future, 1 year from today, at a 25% rate of interest. So he's going to pay $1,750 today. He's going to get $1,750 in a year, and he wants to know, how much should I pay today to buy these resources that will generate for me this future revenue in 1 year of $1,750? Well, clearly, all he needs to do is discount them, right? So we get the discounted marginal revenue products, the 10,000 discounted by 25% to get us the 8, the discount on the land, 5,000 to 4,000, on the labor, 2,000. And if he engages in this production process, again, in the ERE, there's no uncertainty, he'll pay $14,000 to buy the inputs today. He'll sell the output for the sum of the marginal revenue products, which is $1,750. He'll earn $3,500, which is a 25% rate of interest. Now notice, if he were able to command a higher rate of interest, if he could pay, let's say, $10,000 for the inputs and get $1,750 and command a greater than 25% rate of interest, then other capitalists would rush in and invest in this area. Other capitalists would bid up his stock price if he was a public company, or bid up these asset prices, and so on. And this rate of return, this interest return, would be pushed down to the standard normal rate that exists throughout the time market. And so in the time market, that is, in all intertemporal exchange in money, we get one originary interest rate across all activity. Again, we're setting aside the complicating factors. But you can see how this arbitraging process would eliminate any differential interest return that could occur either through production or in lending. The same would be true in just contractual lending. Okay, so Now let me just quickly move forward to uncertainty, and I'll try just to cover, since I've spent too much time on the time preference part, I'll just try to cover the part that relates to this particular question about net income, how it affects the earning of net income. But anyway, you've heard in other discussions already that that there's a fundamental, because again we're temporal finite beings, there's a fundamental uncertainty that we face in action. We cannot perfectly know the realization of our ends at the time that we choose to act toward the attainment of them. We're somewhat in the dark. We can predict them to some degree, but we don't know them with certainty. We have foresight, but not foreknowledge of these things. This, by the way, uncertainty must exist in action because the absence of uncertainty would, again, contradict human nature. It would contradict the finite temporal nature of human beings. So this we can logically show that this must be the case, that we have some uncertainty. The big question in this area comes in identifying the difference between risk and uncertainty, the Frank Knight terminology distinction, or Mises's terminology, the distinction between class probability and case probability. This is really the more controversial area. Not that, there are some economists who argue that real human beings don't face uncertainty. Right? They may put that in their economic agents in their models, but they don't think real human beings act with perfect information and so on. They may say that real human beings act as if they have perfect, close enough or whatever, but that's not quite the same thing. Okay, so anyway, what's this distinction about? As Mises would have it, when we think about instances where we can't perfectly predict the future, our inability stems or is characterized by one of two situations. And they could be mixed together in any particular action, but they're one or two distinguishable elements. One is what he calls class probability. With class probability, we know everything that we need to know to predict about the class. But about each individual event that makes up the class, we don't know anything about that event except that it's a member of the class. This is what Frank Knight called risk. Now notice, if we are predicting in a situation like this with respect to the class of events, then we're in pretty good shape, right? We're in the same position as we would be if we had scientific prediction. If our prediction was just based upon an engineering principle, right? Just a mathematical formula, and we could perfectly predict. We're shooting a rocket to the moon or building a bridge or something. This is why insurance companies are no more inherently risky than any other production process, because their business model is to invest, to use a distribution, but to invest in the whole class of events. They invest, you don't have an insurance company that just insures against hurricane damage in Miami, Florida. Right? If they did that, well, they'd be in trouble because they're not really sure if the hurricane, the frequency with which hurricanes will hit Miami in particular. But they do know over time, at least they assume they have a stable probability density function, what the frequency is of hurricane damage, all the places that hurricanes hit. And so naturally they'll insure people throughout this area, right, to try to get they'll try to insure for the whole class of events. Gambling institutions do this, right? It's not risky for the casino to run a gambling operation any more than it is to run a burger joint. Because they're acting with respect to the whole class of events. The gambler is the guy who goes in and bets money. The gambler is the homeowner who buys the insurance. Because he's betting just on one event, right? He's paying out all the premium. Maybe the hurricane never comes. He's pooling his risk with others. He's willing to do this, but he's the one gambling. Case probability is quite different, right? Case probability is where we do have knowledge. We do have specific knowledge that helps us predict with respect to the particular event in front of us. An example of this would be, oh my. Okay, I'll give you one example and then quit. I'm sorry, I didn't get to the end. But a quick example of this would be something like Steve Jobs, producing the iPad. Do you really think he does something like this in predicting whether he should produce this product? hey, let me look at all of the whole class of events of these devices, right? All the similar devices that have been produced by everybody else. See what the profit and loss activity was of all these other guys. See what the whole class of events is statistically. And then I'll just invest, to hit the average, to hit the mean, if I get this probability density function. Or do you think he knows he can make a better prediction because he knows something specific about his own case that helps him sharpen his prediction more than he can do by ignoring what he might know about his particular case and just basing it on the assumption that he's got no knowledge of any of these cases except that they all make up a class? No, clearly he can do this, right? He knows all sorts of things about his own production that would help him predict beyond what he might know about the class of events. How does he make this prediction? He doesn't do it on the basis of class probability. How could he? He's doing something more than this, right? Something better. And he does this on the basis of his entrepreneurial judgment. He makes a judgment in his mind about the quantitative effect of these factors that he personally knows about his own case and then projects them. And then the last thing I'll say is that based upon this, of course, it follows that every entrepreneur will have his own anticipation of these future marginal revenue products, right? They're not given in the market, but every entrepreneur has his own anticipation of them. And to the extent that his anticipations are correct, he'll earn profit above and beyond the rate of return that he earns on interest, right? He can earn a profit if his predictions are more accurate than his competition. Okay, at this point I'll stop. Thank you.